Hi. Welcome to my panel. This is how to 3D scan your favorite things. 3D scanning is more complicatedly called photogrammetry, and that's just taking a whole lot of pictures of something and performing measurements on it to create a 3D model of it. So to get started, you'll need a camera. Any kind of camera will do. You'll need a computer. Usually the faster the better, but any kind of computer will do. If it's a slow computer, maybe give it some more swap space. Software I'll be covering, mostly Metashape. Another piece of software called Meshroom, depending on time, may have to skim over that. Then I'll be talking about Blender and how to clean up your scans and a bit of Unity. And last thing you'll need is patience. This can take a long time, and you might mess up a whole lot, and you'll have to be really patient about it. Let's get started. Okay, so actually, before you start and take your pictures, you're going to want to choose a subject. And the kind of subject you choose can really determine how good a time you're going to have. So, best advice I can give you is avoid things that are glossy or shiny. Avoid glass. Avoid anything that could move around. So, pets or cars. Avoid anything that's thin, like grass, hair, or bike spokes. And most of all, avoid blank surfaces, because the software is going to look for, they're called features, I'll talk about that later, but they're just little identifiable clumps of pixels, and if you're trying to scan a completely blank surface, there's no detail to be found there. So the best kind of surface you could do is tree bark. It's textured, it has a lot of color in it, and that's exactly the kind of thing you want to try to go for. So after you have your object, I don't know what it could be, but plan how you're going to take your pictures. If it's a building, you want to plan your route around the building, because worst thing that can happen is you show up on location with your camera and you realize you can't even move around in the space, and you waste most of your time just figuring that out before you even start taking pictures. Or say if you were taking pictures of an object, maybe you were in your garage, like my garage is really tiny, and I can't really move around things anymore. I got to rotate things in place. So yeah, you should plan ahead and make sure you can do it first. Next thing, how important lighting is. If your pictures are too dark, you'll have a terrible time. Shadows are the enemy. So going outside is the best thing you can do, but bright sunny days will cast lots of hard shadows everywhere, and as the sun moves, the shadows will move, and so in your scan you'll have, I don't know, 5 or 10 slices of shadows, and it's really ugly. Also, if there's anything that overhangs on whatever you're 3D scanning, you'll see those shadows are just part of the texture now, and it doesn't look very good. Overcast days are the best. Those clouds prevent any hard shadows, and you don't even really see them. They evenly light everywhere. It's great. If you can't shoot outside or weather doesn't permit, because I had to wait a while to scan something I'll show later, you can create a little 3D scanning studio. I've created one in my garage. Again, you want to aim for even lighting. If you have some lights you can point at your object, point them at the walls instead. Let that light bounce onto the walls and reflect back onto your object. That'll keep the lighting even, it'll keep glare down, and it'll make it look a lot nicer. Downside is you'll get a lot less light on your object, so use a long exposure if you can, or just get more lights. And this is very important. If it's artwork or if it's private property, you need to get permission first. If it's artwork, you don't want to freak the artist out. You might be using their artwork in a context they don't want you to use it in. Get permission first. Worst thing is you might bring something into VRChat and then someone might copy it. And it's not good for the artist. If it's private property, also get permission. I have had a lot of people yell at me because I didn't get permission before I started taking pictures. Even when I was on public property, just in a park, someone's family gathering was way far away and they just couldn't stand someone taking pictures, I don't know, 100, 200 feet away. They didn't like it and they yelled at me. So get permission and deal with the fact that people might have an attitude with you. Once you start taking your pictures, these are some good pictures I took from a couple manuals, Metashape and Meshroom manuals. If you're going to do a wall, like there's some nice graffiti, on something, and you want to get just the whole area, don't stand in one place. Never take a picture from the same position. You always want to move a little bit. So, take your picture, take a step to the right, take another picture, take another step to the right. You're trying to build a lot of parallax. The software is going to take these pictures and build stereo images out of them. Stereo, like how your eyes are side by side. And if you stand in one place, that is a great way to build a panorama. That is a terrible thing for photogrammetry. Same thing if you're doing a room. Back up against the wall. Take pictures looking straight ahead to the other wall. And just move along the perimeter. When you hit a corner, make a gradual, smooth turn. No sharp 90-degree turns. You want to maintain about 2/3 overlap picture to picture every time. The software is going to match each picture to every other picture. And if you have a disconnect in your pictures, then you'll just have a section of your scan that can't come together. And it's really hard to fight it and get it to work. If you're doing an object, again, just make a nice smooth arc around it. Next up is what you should set your camera to. So this is something photographers know all about, and I've had to teach myself. Learning how to use a camera has been a real journey for me. I'm still on it. So if you can, at all possible, set your ISO as low as you can. The higher your ISO is, the more the camera is going to amplify the light and the uglier it's going to get. And that's going to affect your 3D scan. You might even see just weird grain baked into the textures of your final model. You want to set your shutter speed as fast as possible. You probably won't be able to, but you want to try because that's going to give you sharp pictures. And you want to close the aperture down as tight as possible, but not too much. Generally the aperture is going to define how crisp and bright your pictures are, but also how deep your focus is. A wide open aperture will give you a very bright, nice photo, but it's going to be very shallow, and the background and foreground will be out of focus. I tend to stay in between 4 and 8. I find that works. A lesson I had to learn was, first thing I did was I cranked the aperture all the way down to 22 on my camera, and the camera focused as far away as I could see, but the picture was soft, and that's because the light was diffracting. So it's a balance. You gotta find it. That's why there are really expensive cameras that can achieve all 3 of those things without any sacrifice. If you're using a cell phone, you generally won't have to worry about that at all. There's a lot of software in phone cameras that prevent them from taking bad pictures. You won't get good pictures. Well, you won't get great pictures, but you'll always have, an okay or a good picture, and that's just the nature of how they work. Lastly, at the bottom right, once you start, you've taken your lens and you zoomed, don't adjust it. If it's got a lens lock, lock it down. If it doesn't, tape it in place. It's really important. As you begin, the software will correct for any lens distortions, and if you change the zoom, that's going to change the lens distortions, and it'll only correct once. So just keep it in place, or what I like to do is I like to use a prime lens, just depending on what I'm taking pictures of, because I don't have to worry about zoom at that point. I can't mess it up. Here is an example of how to move around a space. This is my garage. It's tiny. So each square in that picture is where I once stood with my camera on a tripod taking a picture. It's kind of dark in there, and that's because I was testing low light. But so I had my camera up on a tripod, keep it nice and steady, backed my camera up against a wall, took a picture, moved it, took a picture, moved it. Nice, smooth round turns around the corners. I took 2 levels to just get as much coverage as I could. And then after I had just the room, just generally, I went in for some detail shots. Here's an example of the kind of overlap I'm talking about. I'm still trying to get that 2/3 each and every picture. You can see in the center of the room, those are my my very bright and very, very hot photography lights. They did not come out at all because they are translucent and shiny surfaces. So you get certain objects, you'll get some weird artifacts. I'll be talking about this later. This is my camera that I usually use to 3D scan things, and I 3D scanned it with my phone. So I made a couple of loops around it, and then I went in for detail shots after that. Again, this is the kind of overlap you want. I took a whole lot of pictures, about 160, and I only ended up using about 110 of them. Just, I didn't need to use any more, and I had to get rid of some pictures. This is my skull, and I took pictures of it. It was on a tripod. I rotated the tripod around, and about every 7.5 degrees, I took another picture. I took tons of pictures of this thing. It took a while, but I didn't have to use all of them, as it turned out. That's fine. I'm glad I had the pictures so I could not use them later. I mean, again, nice smooth arcs around everything you're taking a picture of. Again, this is the kind of overlap. I've removed a couple of the in-between pictures just to show you that it's actually moving. So as you're taking pictures, there's a few things you should consider. Don't move anything. This software expects the world to be static and immobile, and that is not realistic. But, you know, it can deal with a little movement. Like if there's a car in the background, you might have to throw that picture out. But if it's kind of small and off in the distance, it won't notice it. There's a person that you didn't notice just walking by as you're looking down your camera, you probably are going to have to get rid of that picture. But it's fine, because if you took a ton of pictures, you can just get rid of one. It's no big deal. Again, I want to stress even lighting. That'll make everything look better and work better. If you're in a dark space, you might be tempted to use your flash. Don't do it, because that flash is going to cast shadows everywhere. It's going to create different kinds of glare on every surface, and you'll have a terrible time. That can make it really hard to light dark places, especially dark, big places, but there you are. Phone cameras, again, it's hard to take bad pictures with them, but a lot of the pictures you take with phone cameras are actually blurry if you zoom in, and any bit of blur is going to affect how well your final scan comes out. So as you're taking pictures, like zoom in on your little screen and see if they're actually good. Usually with phone scans, I gotta try a couple times before it's really good. Regular cameras, you can take phenomenal, wonderful pictures with regular cameras. The downside is you have to learn how to use them. You can't just spend a bunch of money and then expect everything's gonna be great. You have to learn how to use them, and I'm still learning how to use mine really well. Again, but on the flip side, you have a lot of lenses you can choose from. You can do things with the depth of field that can make certain situations a lot easier to work with, but you have to learn all that. I gotta stress again, take a lot of pictures. It's maybe if you take 1,000 pictures, you really only need 100. You can run all 1,000 of them if they're all great, but it'll just take a long time, and you might not even see any real increase in detail in your model. But that's the reason you took all of them, is because you can get rid of them. It's fine. There's going to be bad pictures. Don't use them. really good advice is review your pictures. When I'm done, it's so tempting to to just dump my pictures in my computer and press go and get back to it, but I gotta review the pictures, so I don't waste a whole lot of time waiting for a model that isn't going to be any good when it comes out. Next thing I'm not really going to cover, but I want to touch on it, is video. Videogrammetry is a thing. You can 3D scan stuff with video. The downside is this is a lower resolution image. That is lower quality. Its video has a lot of compression. I've done some tests, like 1 minute of video that I broke out about 300 frames from, versus 30 still pictures. Those 30 pictures created a better model than the video did. The flip side is it took me about 10 minutes to take those 30 pictures, and it took me 1 minute to take that video. Here are a couple examples. I've done some more interesting things with video, but I don't have permission from the artist yet to show that stuff. So here we are. On the left, that's me. My friend Kevin circled around and took some video of me, and I've got a 3D model of me. It's great. On the right is the head of my friend Green Dragon. I talked him through using his phone. I believe that was a Google Pixel 3. Put his head on a little rotating display stand and just kind of panned his camera down. When that was all done, I ran the pictures through a program called FFmpeg to break out individual stills. And it was a little tricky, but it came together pretty well, and I'm happy with the results. I'm going to talk about my camera scan, and it took me a couple tries to do this. Ultimately, what worked is I got my big reflector. I waited for an overcast day. I had about 15 minutes before the clouds cleared and my perfect lighting was ruined, but I stuck my camera on top of the reflector to reflect a bit of light up underneath the camera. It's a hunk of black plastic, and as I'm, bent over with my phone pointed up at the sky, it's trying to focus on just the piercing bright gray overcast sky, and the white balance wasn't good, and reflector fixed that. I got enough light in it that it behaved. And I took about 160 photos. So what I did with those photos was I carefully reviewed all of them before I did anything. Some of the pictures were where the white balance was off. They were too dark or too bright. I got rid of them. Some of them, they were a little too blurry. Some of them I was standing too far away. Some of them the neighbors were in the background and they were causing problems. Once you reviewed all your pictures, you dump the remaining pictures into your software and click Start. And then you begin waiting. How long do you have to wait? Depends on how fast your computer is and how many pictures you have, and how good they are. I found pictures from a DSLR tend to run and process a lot faster than pictures from a phone camera. I'm not sure why. I suspect it has something to do with just image compression, but before I rebuild my computer, I might be waiting hours or days. On one memorable time, it was about 2 weeks. 2 weeks of not being able to do anything with my computer while it is just loudly humming. Now I don't have to wait nearly as long. And when you're done waiting, review the results, and if they're not to your liking, start changing settings until they are. So in the program called Metashape, you use it in 3 distinct steps. First things first, you drag and drop all your pictures into chunk 1. It's in a pane on the left. Then you right-click chunk 1, and you click Align Cameras. You're going to get a couple settings, like do you want to do this in high quality? Do you want to turn on guided matching? If you're rotating the object in place instead of rotating around it, you can turn on Remove Stationary Tie Points to help out a lot. But you just gotta wait. And when it's done, you'll have a point cloud. And the point cloud is just all the little features, unique aspects in every picture. It's matched them between pictures, triangulated their position, and triangulated the position of all the cameras. And what you might want to do is maybe a camera doesn't align right. You'll see it floating off in space somewhere you couldn't possibly have been. Usually like in a wall. So just click the camera and get rid of it, or reset the alignment and try again. Once you have your point cloud, then right-click chunk one again and click build mesh. You'll get some settings. Again, like high quality takes longer, but when it's done, you'll have a model. Metashape will colorize the model for you. I've turned that off to show you some of the artifacts that can happen. My camera lens, you can see at the end of the lens, it's concave instead of convex. And it's weirdly lumpy. That's because the camera lens is transparent and it's got all this weird glare going on inside of it. It didn't come out at all. And then also at the bottom of the camera, there's a bit of my tripod left from where I had it mounted. So if you are actually satisfied with your model, then you right-click chunk one again. You click build texture. You'll get some options. And when it's done, usually this is the best your model's going to look. This is also terrible for a game. A whole bunch of high-resolution textures and over 100,000 triangles. Bad for games. Oh yeah, and the whole thing is over 13 megabytes. So, on my computer, this took about 11 minutes. My old computer would have been about an hour. So next we're going to talk about what you should do to clean these models up and make them good for something like a video game, maybe VRChat. I like to use a piece of software called Blender. It's free and open source. So you export the model out of Metashape. It'll be an FBX. You import it into Blender. So there might be weird, just lumps of stuff floating out in space. You can delete those. If there's holes where nothing was captured, or say the software couldn't find any features, or it's just a blank wall, so there's nothing there, you can fill that in. It's fine. If an area is kind of rough, which you usually get with phone pictures, it's this real distinctive lumpiness. You can just use the sculpt tool and just smooth it out. It's fine. And then, importantly, you can use the decimate modifier in Blender to reduce the poly count down from like over 100,000 down to something reasonable like 1,000 or 2,000. And then you can import it back into Metashape to redo your textures or bake them using Blender if you know how to do that. And most importantly, and this implies to all the photogrammetry software, don't change the position of the object. It might be turned upside down and floating off in space and kind of inconvenient to work around it, or like parent it to a null or something to move that instead, because where that object is in space is going to affect where the textures get applied to. So here's a couple examples. On this model, there's a couple lumps just hanging out inside the model for some reason. To find all of them, I selected one polygon on it, pressed Ctrl-L to select everything linked to that, and then inverted my selection. So I got all the weird lumps, and then I also selected all the vertices that made up the bit of my tripod that was still there, and I just deleted all of them. That left a couple holes in my camera that I had to fill, so I selected all the vertices around the holes, and I used the fill tool. Grid fill works. Grid fill works not always. So after I had filled the hole, I had some giant polygons, and in photogrammetry software, the smaller your polygons are, the finer and more detailed your textures are going to be. But generally, you just want the polygons to be about the same size as their neighbors. So I took the knife tool, I made a couple zigzags on all my big polygons, and then I used the triangulate faces tool to turn them into triangles, and it was fine. I wasn't going to try and rebuild in the bottom left, I wasn't going to try and rebuild the lens by hand, so I took an icosphere and used the Boolean modifier to I merged them together to get a nice uniform shape that was made out of triangles. Lastly, I used the decimate modifier, and I had to play with just how much detail I wanted removed. You can see it kind of messes up your textures a whole lot. So that's why it's important to export your model out of Blender, import it back into Metashape, and then rerun the texture step. The end result is a nice, clean, low poly model that looks great and performs great. And do you mind spawning that in for me? Ha. And here we are. And this is my camera as I use it. It even has my tape that I use to lock my lens down. And you can pass this around if you want to. Yeah, and it's a whole lot of fun. I like doing it. Oh yeah, and just less than 1 megabyte, really good. If you show this to an actual game dev who makes game assets, they're gonna scream because the texture is usually really hideous. It's randomly laid out by a machine, but, you know. Then I also did a 3D scan of my skull. I'm not gonna have enough time to really cover this in the detail I wanted to. But my garage wasn't big enough to rotate around the object, so I used a couple of tripods to just rotate it instead and took a picture every time. I dropped them into Meshroom. Meshroom is a free piece of software. And I want to cover it because it's what I started using because it was free. For the final scan I ended up using, out of the 350 pictures I took, I used up about 144 of them. There was 500,000 triangles and 2 high-res textures, and it was about 50 megabytes. If we don't count all the trial and error, it took me to get the right settings. It'd be 2 hours, but it was more like 6 actually. Oh, you can keep that. Your results may vary with Meshroom. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes Metashape works and sometimes it doesn't. So usually I switch to the other one. It's just a tool. If it doesn't work, switch. Meshroom is also very slow, so you're gonna be waiting for a while. This is the first iteration of my skull. There's a couple settings that I know will reduce the quality, make it run very fast, and hey, it worked. Didn't get the inside of the skull. That's just a solid chunk. And so at that point, it was kind of late at night. I said, I know what I'm doing. I cranked all the settings I know that'll increase quality to maximum. And I clicked go, and I let it cook overnight. And when I got back to it in the morning, it was a cube. It was a cube. Yep. I don't know why it's a cube. Possibly it had something to do with the fact that this scan took about, 4 or 6 hours to run. Maybe there's too much detail. Usually doesn't like it when you do that. Surprisingly, in computers, too much detail can be a bad thing. You want just the right amount. So I started over. Let's see, a couple of settings I know help out with the quality. If you're doing an feature extraction, like there's the SIF descriptor, DSIFT, and a case. A case works great on skin, but not great on anything else. Usually, like, this applies to Meshroom too. Just because you set it to high or ultra quality doesn't mean you'll have a better time. And here I just left, like, the number of features it finds, I left that at normal. Then on the right, there's feature matching. Generally, I just use guided matching. Sometimes if you have cameras that aren't lining up, that'll help. It will make it take longer too. This is an important one. There's a step called structure for motion. If you're having really bad results, it's set to 0, which is auto. Like, you can look at your pictures and cycle through them and see how many features it's finding per picture. And if you have a couple that instead of getting like 10,000, it's only finding 100, set a limit somewhere. I set it for 2,000 on this scan, and that solved all the errors right away. So I also want to talk about what is a feature, because you'll hear talk about this all the time in 3D scanning. And a feature is anything, it's any unique clump of pixels. If you were to take a sheet of paper and put a dot in the center and run it through the software, it would find that dot because that dot is unique. It's dark, surrounded by this big blank area. Different algorithms to find features will find different kinds of features. So one algorithm might find just the dot, Another might find the dot and also the entire sheet of paper, because that's also unique. On here, you can see there's a whole bunch of little blue squares everywhere, and those are our features. Every time there's a red dot, that's where that was matched into a different picture. And this scan, I had a hard time with the eyes. The eyes are made out of this black cross-stitch fabric. It was too dark for my camera to actually make out. So I could go through my pictures and like brighten up that area. That's still something I'm learning how to do, so I just put up with it. Other settings, there's depth map. You can increase the number, you can increase the downscale, which will make it take less time, but will give you, but your end result won't be as good. Depth map filtering, couple settings there. If you increase and decrease those, you'll have a cleaner result, but you might be missing parts of your model. Meshing, depending on how much RAM your computer is, you might not want to touch this. The default settings are just perfect if you've got 16 gigs of RAM or 8 gigs of RAM. I've got a lot of RAM, so I can increase the minimum points about as high as I want. I generally don't because it doesn't actually help. And then texturing. If you're doing game assets, I know it's awful, but don't use PNG, use JPEG, because that's going to save it's going to save the texture size. I know it's not going to look good, but also assets with a huge file size aren't very great. So in the red, these are Meshroom is you set it up, it's node based. So you can create really interesting setups, or you can very easily iterate through setups. On the top column in the bottom picture, that was the initial run it had, just using the default settings. And the result of that is on the upper left. You can see there's my 3 rings of cameras, and there's cameras flying off in space because they didn't match correctly. So on, what was that, the feature matching node, I right-clicked it and clicked duplicate from here. I want to keep my previous results because there's something to be learned from that. And I enabled guided matching. Then you can see the output from that in the middle picture. Most of it worked, but there's still a couple cameras that are just kind of flying away. I've got a gap in my rings. So that's the structure for motion node. I duplicated that and set my minimum features to 2000. Then on the right, I've went ahead to the texturing node, and it worked great. It worked okay. So I took it through Blender and I cleaned it up a little bit, doing all the steps I discussed previously. And I was still getting some bad textures. They weren't working right in the eyes. Again, there's just no features found there. And this version of Meshroom, I don't know, I'm still running tests. It's not really consistent about it, but it's giving me some texture problem. This version I used was 2021.0. I've had consistent good luck with 2019 too. Still running some tests on it though. And on the middle, that's Suzanne from Blender, and this is a fun thing. This 3D steps I talked about where you align your cameras, you build your mesh, and then you apply textures to your mesh. They're completely independent from each other. So you can take a point cloud from one program, give it to a totally different incompatible program, and it'll just use it. It's fine. Say you can build a mesh out of that, you can apply a texture to it. You don't even have to use the original object you created. You can just take anything and put it in there. It's fine. And I like to, when I'm done with the scan, drop Suzanne in because it's fun. I align the model up with the original skull scan about in the same place. Then unlike in Metashape, you don't import it. You go to the texturing. In Meshroom, you go to the texturing node and you unlink it from the entire node graph. And then there's a little box called just mesh. You drop in the file path for that mesh and let it go. And the results, guys have the skull spawned in. And it looks pretty good. I still wasn't happy with the final result. The eyes didn't really come out. So in Blender, I just use the clone brush and a bit of eye texture came out right, so I just used the clone brush and painted it in. It worked out great. The final result is 2 medium resolution textures, less than 8 megabyte, less than a megabyte, and it took way too long to do. Way too long. All those hours of trial and error, but you know, there it is. And it looks great though. You can pass this around too. I had a lot of fun doing it. Okay, and that's the end. I'd like to thank myself for doing this panel. I'd also like to thank Eric Strother for letting me use the skull mask he created. And the dragon head from middle of the panel, that was my friend Green Dragon's head. You can find them all on Twitter. Links to the different software, there's Meshroom, Metashape, Blender, and Unity. I completely forgot to talk about Unity. So it's really easy to attach your finished models to an object, to a Unity project, say like an avatar. You just export your object. If you're using Metashape, just export it as an FBX, and then drag it onto your avatar's skeleton wherever you want it to stick. If you're using Meshroom, that program generates OBJs, which I have not been able to get them to play nice with Unity. Instead, I just save them inside of Blender and drag and drop the Blender file into Unity, and then it'll go through the import and everything works great. At that, we have time for questions if anyone has any.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. What is your thought on 3D scanning systems, like for smaller objects, like an actual 3D scanner?
I don't have any experience with those. Oh my goodness, that would have been about 15 years ago. I was playing around with a piece of software called David Laser Scan, and I had like a laser level and a really horrible webcam that and I just never got it to work. I really don't have any experience with them, but that would be better for doing small stuff. Because it has to do with lenses and optics. It's very difficult to focus in on very small objects. So I guess that's all I really have to say. It would be the only reliable, consistent way to do small things.
All right. Thank you.
Excuse me. Okay, so I had a question to do with actually something that I was experiencing with Meshroom, because I tried Meshroom I basically took pictures around my original Oculus Quest. I don't know if it was too black though, because what ended up happening is that I tried to get the pictures, and then basically it just kind of broke, if that makes sense. When I came back, like I let it do the overnight thing, and I didn't change anything. I just kind of clicked scan because that's what everybody told me to do.
Yeah. Meshroom will complete it'll complete the full thing for you, start to finish.
Yeah, but the thing is that it kind of didn't really the Quest one's very black, and I think that's what caused it to be all garbled.
Yeah. What environment did you take the pictures in? Was it your room? Was it bright or dark?
I think it was my room, and I think it was bright.
Okay. Then I'm gonna guess that it was the dark plastic. What you can do in Meshroom, there's a big window that shows your pictures. In the lower left-hand corner, I think the icon is like 3 dots. You can click that and it'll show you the features that it's found. And they'll appear as little blue squares or just whatever you have them to appear as. And that way you can kind of diagnose what's going on, like why didn't this thing show up. So as if you remember on my slides, I had the eyeballs in my skull. Just part of them, no, there weren't any features there at all because it was too dark. So my suggestion would be you can take those pictures through a photo program and brighten them up. You might increase the contrast a bit. It'll affect how your textures come out, but the scan will work. You might also try enabling the Akaze feature set. That'll make your scan take a lot longer, but it's able to find features just otherwise where the normal SIFT one doesn't work. And then if it's really lumpy, you can still take it into Blender and clean up the results. So once the textures are applied to it, it'll look better.
All right. Well, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I've got a question here from Discord. Black Jungle is asking, for scanning objects, what do you recommend? Using a rotating table with infinite background, or going around the object in real space for more tracking points?
That depends. If you're going around the object, then if you're worried about your tracking points and going around the object, last place I lived, the walls of my garage were just made out of particle board, and that's a really good surface. I mean, it was hideous stuff. It was unfinished just for a garage, but excellent surface for photogrammetry because there's so many features to find. It actually slowed the program down because it was having to sort through so many features just in the background, but I never had a bad alignment in there. Or using a turntable, that depends on, I guess, how big the object is and if you want to automate it or not. If you're going to use a turntable, I'd texture it, so make sure it's a matte finish, and maybe matte wood grain or nothing. Don't use anything symmetrical, because if you rotate it 180, then it's going to rely on the object you have on the turntable to actually figure out, am I actually in the same position as I started, or am I 180 around from it? So like, I saw someone using cow spots at one point, and I guess that worked out pretty well for them. I don't know. It depends. If you can light it evenly from all angles, you can move around. Or if you can light it really well, really softly from one angle, then you can use a turntable. It wouldn't really matter. Meshroom might have a hard time with a turntable. It doesn't officially support that. If you play with things and like make the background kind of blurry by setting your aperture, by opening your aperture up so it's so your depth of field is shallow, then it'll have a much better time. Otherwise, I just use Metashape. It's got an option for that. So, I guess take it or leave it, really.
Okay, cool. Thank you for that. I'll take one more from Discord, and then I'll toss it back to the people here in the audience. I've got a question here from Nova. Do you have any good ideas for backgrounds for registration when doing photogrammetry?
Registration? Oh, yeah, they're talking about reality capture. I'm still learning reality capture. Anything that's textured. I mean, nah, not like the beige walls of your apartment if you're me. So let's see. Particle board. That's excellent. That's all I've got to really say. Otherwise, if registration doesn't mean when the photos are aligned, I can't answer that question. Sorry, not yet at least.
Okay, no worries, understood. I'll toss this back to someone here in the audience if there are any more questions.
Hello? Okay. My question was for the software that calculates all the photos put together. Is that primarily CPU based or GPU based?
It can be both. Metashape might be your only option if you don't have a NVIDIA GPU. Because anyway, so Metashape is it can run entirely on your CPU, and I've done that with my dinky little travel laptop. I 3D scanned the hotel I was in. It had a giant atrium. I just had everything run on the CPU. It took all day, but I was busy working, so I was fine. And then Meshroom, most of that takes place on the CPU. In the feature extraction step, you can disable force CPU extraction, so it'll run feature extraction for feature sets it can on the GPU. That's good if you have just a bazillion photos. On my old computer, it was actually faster just to always have it run on the CPU because then my NVIDIA GPU was pretty slow. I had a little NVIDIA GTX 1050 just for CUDA support for photogrammetry. And Metashape, it supports CPU, OpenCL, and CUDA, and it's pretty fast. So.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question. Would suspending an object with a thin wire be a good idea to make an all-around model?
As long as you don't move it at all. As long as, otherwise, that's fine. Just don't move it. Other setups I've seen people use, that would be the cheapest one. Otherwise, you could use like polarization filters and a big sheet of Lexan and a polarized flash, and it gets expensive.
Thank you.
You can hear me, right?
Yes.
Okay, I have a question more on the Blender side of things. So I have a history with messing around with models. I ended up putting one of my models into The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, and I had to dissipate the mesh quite a bit to a point where it would like make the texture not look right on the model. What would you suggest people do to like avoid that sort of mess up with the textures with the UVs?
Yeah. You gotta, on your new low poly model, make a new UV and bake it. Like I've actually done that with my model. You can't see it too well right now, but the original model has, I think it was a couple 100,000 polygons, and that was way too high quality, so I hit it with the decimate modifier, and then I redid all the UVs, and I baked the textures from the old model onto the new one. It took a couple of tries to get it to work just right.
Okay.
I got another question here from Discord. Let's see here. I got a question here from Wrench. Would suspending an object with a thin wire, fishing line, dental floss, etc., would it be a good idea to make an all-around model?
Yes, again, as long as you don't touch it. Like, don't even breathe too hard around it, so.
Okay, understood. Oh, gotcha. Sorry about that. All right, I got one more question here. Let's see this. So from Talo, I've got. Do you have any experience with the iPhone or Apple's new lidar? I can't see if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Lidar scanning system for accurate 3D modeling.
Yes, I do. I've 3D scanned. That's actually the reason why I went ahead and bit the bullet and purchased an iPhone 12 Pro. Was for the LiDAR scanner, and it varies. The upside is you can scan your whole apartment in 50 minutes. The downside is it's not a great model. The actual grid for the LiDAR sensor is pretty low resolution, but it's primarily for just making the camera focus a lot better in total darkness. It's okay. It's very fast. I've been doing a lot of traveling for work, and it's been a lot of fun just stopping at places where I got to stretch my legs and taking a quick scan. Again, they're not very high resolution. I have ran into issues where it doesn't play nice if I go back over something I've already scanned. There you are. It's very fast. that's incredible. I really can't understate that. Overstate that. It's very, very fast, but it's very low quality too. So if you want to get the general shape of something, along with some general textures that are usually blurry and warped, absolutely go for it.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much. I think we have time for one more question. Does anyone in the audience have a question here? If not, then there you go. All right, this will be the last one, and then if you want, you can close it out.
Oh, after you, mate.
So my question is there such thing as too close as long as you can see the entire object?
That is something I forgot to touch on. When you're taking your photos, you want to fill as much of the frame as you can with the object of interest. So too close would be if you can't focus on the whole thing. A lot of lenses have a minimum focal distance, and you want to stay just outside of that. Yeah, just as long as you can focus on it, and the whole thing's in focus, that's it. That's why it's hard to take pictures of miniatures or just very small things, because you're going to go inside that minimum focal distance of your lens.
Thank you.
You had another question. That one was pretty quick. Come on up here. Go on, go.
What's the recommended amount of dedicated WAM for a computer doing this kind of work?
That depends on the step you're in. Generally 32 gigabytes is more than enough. So while working on some very large projects, I had a couple of SSDs where I'd allocated about 64 gigs of their space just to swap space, because in the texturing step, I needed about 240 gigabytes of RAM to actually run the project. And so, the operating system just dumped all the RAM to SSDs instead. But just for doing everything else, matching points or small projects where you don't have a couple thousand pictures, 32 gigs is good.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, if you have 128 like me, it makes things go much faster. It turns a project from like, hey, I'm just going to walk away from my computer for days, into this is going to take a couple hours instead. Specifically the texturing step.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Well, thank you everyone for coming here. I had a lot of fun. I hope you learned something, and I really can't wait to see more 3D scan worlds in here. I absolutely love them. So